And at the same time,
Yeah.
Folks, thanks for coming to today's Brownbag. I want to tell you about just a few things that are coming up later in the week before I introduce our speaker today. I think I sent you down a note regarding the history department. They've got a couple of different candidates. They already had one on Thursday, but they're continuing to interview. Eric Scott is today, and he's going to be giving a presentation in Pine Room in Kansas City at 4 o'clock, and that's devoted to familiar strangers, the Georgian diaspora in the multi-ethnic Soviet Empire. And there's going to be a reception afterwards, so I'll set this aside if you want to take a look at it. And then Scott Palmer is coming in on Thursday, and he's going to again be giving a presentation. That'll be the Burge Union at 309 in the Olympian Room, and that is devoted to from the icon to the facts, technological context in Russia's present and past. Aside from that, we've got a number of other things going on. Marie-Alice Leroux in architecture is going to be giving a presentation on Thursday as well. That is from 1 to 2 p.m. over in the Spencer Museum Bar, and it's devoted to socialist imagery. And then on Thursday, we've got the first of our Turkish films. It's going to start at 7 o'clock, and then on Friday night at the Kino, we've got is A Bitter Taste of Freedom, all about Poet Korsakov. So a lot of things going on this week. Our speaker today is Charles Bartles, who has a degree in Russian and also is a Reese alum from right here in KU. And he has served, been deployed both Afghanistan and Iraq, is a Purple Heart recipient, currently works as a research analyst at the Foreign Military Studies Office in Fort Leavenworth. And this marks sort of the latest in a number of different collaborations with KU professors. And so very happy to have him here talking about military reform in Russia.
Hey, my name is Chuck, and talk a little bit about Anatoli Serdyukov, and he's the defense minister for Russia. And by a lot of accounts, he's done the most radical reforms in the Russian military in the last 100 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Serdyukov and some of the reforms that he's making. And kind of before we kick this off, I kind of want to explain some of the differences to the people who are not real knowledge about the ins and outs of the Russian military. It's quite a bit different than the U.S. military, so you can't make a one-for-one comparison when you talk about the Russian military and our military. So just want to lay a couple things out. The Russians have a much different, broader scope of military than we do. They have militarized intelligence and security services. So like their FBI, the NSA, the police force, all these different things in the United States we're used to seeing civilians man. In Russia, we see military guys doing these jobs, uniformed military personnel. So when I'm talking about military reforms, I mean specifically for the Ministry of Defense or like our Department of Defense, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, these branches of service. So I'm not talking about like the FSB or the MVD or these other branches. So before we start talking about military reform, it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the way the Russian military looked before Serdyukov started making some changes. And before we talk about that, we really need to talk about the way the Soviet Army looked after World War II. And the Soviet Army after World War II was gigantic. It had, I think, about 5 million people under arms. And there was a large professional officer corps and non-commissioned officer corps. So they had very professional officers and enlisted personnel. And the Russians believed that from their experience in World War II that future conflicts would be high intensity and relatively short in duration. So it wouldn't have like our long war that we've had in Afghanistan. We've been there for 10 years. They thought maybe a war would be a couple of years at most. Probably a lot shorter. So, and then they believed that the future conflicts would be large scale in nature, and there would be mass mobilizations and a need for successive waves of forces. So they need to bring a lot of people up to combat readiness very quickly, and then send them to fight. And it's call this the mass mobilization principle. This desire to mobilize massive numbers of personnel, and kind of the prime trait of this mass mobilization principle is the belief that there's emphasis on quantity instead of quality. So they just wanted to get as many guys as possible to the field with guns. That was their goal. And the way they did this was they had all males serve an obligatory 2-year, not sentence, but serve a 2-year term in the Russian military as a conscript. And then after they served their 2 years as a conscript, they were kind of discharged into like a reserve, but not like a reserve that we kind of think of the U.S. military, where, the guys going 1 weekend a month and doing some training, once a year. It's a different type of reserve where they just, they're in a holding pool, and then they'd only be called in case there was an emergency. And the way that the Soviets envisioned bringing up massive numbers of troops, but not having all these men on active duty at one time, is they had what they called skeleton units. And this is a practice they had, like small cadres of officers would be manning units, and in the event of a war, they'd bring all these reservists and drafted soldiers in and put them in these units, and they'd train them up, and then they'd go to war. And some other factors are the institutional knowledge. So this didn't really have to do with the mobilization principle, but another aspect kind of developed in the post-Soviet or post-World War II years is that all the institutional knowledge was focused in the officer corps. So it really wasn't if you were an enlisted soldier in the Russian military or in the Soviet military, there was really no career path for you. There's like in the United States Army, you could be 30 years as an enlisted soldier and you could have a full career path. But in the Russian Army or the Soviet Army, that really wasn't a possibility. So a lot of these guys just came in, they did their 2 years. If they wanted to serve longer periods of time in the military, they would become an officer. If they didn't, they would just exit service. And the other big difference between the Soviet military and then our United States military was the Afghan War and the Vietnam Wars. For the U.S. military, the Vietnam War was kind of an all-encompassing experience. Pretty much everybody went to Vietnam. If you're a career military officer, you were pretty much expected to go to Vietnam. For the Soviets, it's quite a bit different. They only had a small percentage of the military guys, professional military soldiers, actually served in Vietnam or actually served in Afghanistan. So you didn't get that all-encompassing experience that the U.S. had in Vietnam. And so what the difference that made is that the U.S. military started seeing like guerrilla warfare and small low-scale conflict as sometimes kind of the future, not just large-scale Cold War scenarios, but also smaller scale. And the Russians and the Soviets never really got that because they were so focused on the lessons from World War II. And this is kind of the result of mass mobilization principle and no emphasis or no desire to focus on low scale warfare. The combination of reliance on mass mobilization principle and the fact that the officer corps was sole repository of institutional knowledge resulted in an extremely rank heavy structure of the armed forces that was only concerned with large scale conflict. So because you had these skeleton units and because you had this huge infrastructure that was gauged for going to war, you had a lot of really high-ranking people, and like you think of a kind of rank structure. It's kind of like the university structure. You got one chancellor on top, and you have a bunch of students on bottom. It's called the pyramid. And you look at what the Russians had or what the Soviets had, and it didn't quite look like that. You saw a bunch of people on the bottom, a bunch of people in the middle, and a very small top. So it wasn't like a real pyramid like we're used to seeing in the U.S. military. Look at the post-Soviet era. After the Soviet Union collapsed, obviously there's huge change in the political situation and the geopolitical situation. There wasn't that Cold War threat that the Russians had seen before, or the Soviets had seen before. But Russia still wanted to maintain the same military capacity and infrastructure that maintained in the Soviet era. So I think they had about a 5 million man army in the Soviet times before the Soviet Union collapsed. But they maintained that same infrastructure into the Russian Federation. There was no emphasis or no effort to downsize. And they still maintained all like the institutions and the training. So, and this extremely rank heavy structure resulted into a general officer for every 120 personnel. And I don't know, a lot of you guys don't have a lot of military experience, but to put it in kind of perspective, the U.S. Air Force, which has the most general officers, in comparison to enlisted soldiers, we have about one general for every 1,045 soldiers. So that's kind of the difference in Putin, the first years that Putin was in power, the army that he had, compared to the U.S. Army at the same time. And so when Putin arrived, he was very well received by the officer corps. Yeltsin was seen as kind of an embarrassment, and Putin was definitely, he was seen as the guy when he came in. And he did do some, kind of superficial talk about reforming the military, but generally he was really hands-off when it came to military reform. He really didn't make too much of an effort to change anything. And when that started to change was the Kursk submarine disaster. I think it was in August 12th of 2000, the Kursk submarine sunk. And it was really embarrassing. Putin felt like the military leadership wasn't telling him the full story. He was getting a lot of double talk, and he couldn't get a straight answer. And I think at that point, Putin decided that it was time to make some changes in the Russian military. And eventually, this led to Putin sacking Marshal Sergeyev. He was the colonel. He was the chief of staff at the time, the chief of staff of the Russian general staff. And probably just talk a little bit about what the general staff is and the Ministry of Defense. In the United States, we have a Department of Defense, and we have a Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we really don't see what the Joint Chiefs of Staff does. It works on a higher level, but it's a lot different concept in the Soviet or the Russian military. The General Staff's a very important body. A lot of the things that our Ministry of Defense or that our Department of Defense does, the Russian General Staff does. So, like some of the procurement of the weapons systems and like intelligence gathering and a bunch of functions we don't usually see our Joint Chiefs of Staff does, the Russian General Staff does do. And in the event of wartime, the General Staff actually takes control of the military and conducts operations. And it's a totally different system that we have. We have like the MACOM system where we have the world divided up into geographic regions, and the general in charge of that region controls that region. Not the way it is in the Soviet or the Russian army. So at this time, Putin appointed Sergei Ivanov, and he was the first civilian defense minister in the Russian Federation, or in the Soviet Union for that matter. And that was pretty significant. Until that time, there'd always been uniformed military personnel. And as soon as Ivanov came in and started making some of these changes, him and General Kvashin, he was the General Chief of Staff, started butting heads. And eventually, Kvashin had to go. So Ivanov forced Kvashin to retire, to resign. And there's been a lot of criticism of Ivanov of not doing anything. I think Ivanov was he controlled the Ministry of Defense from, I think it was 2000 until 2007. But he did start the first talk of serious reforms in the Russian military. And some of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to remove the regimental or the division structure from the Russian army and replace it with brigades. And he also wanted to eliminate the conscription system. The conscription system is very unpopular in Russia. It's notorious for abuse and low pay, and a lot of other nasty stories are in the media about what happens to these conscripts. Draft evasion is very common. No parent wants their kid to go join the Russian military. It's very common. And then he also first talked about restructuring the Soviet military district system. Russia at the time was divided into 6 military districts, and he didn't really say how, but he wanted to redo it. They just thought there was too much overhead for those military districts. So in 2007, Ivanov, he was promoted to the first deputy prime minister, and so that left the defense minister position vacant. So at that time, this man, Anatoli Serdyukov, he was appointed to fill the position. And Serdyukov was totally different than anybody else that had come before him. He really had no military experience. He'd done the 2-year conscription thing in Novosibirsk for 2 years right out of high school, but he really had no military experience to speak of, military experience. And he actually had his background in business. He had, I think he'd been in St. Petersburg and worked at some kind of furniture company. So eventually kind of gained the pejorative, the furniture salesman. That's how eventually the military guys started referring to him. He didn't like some of the things he did. And she had a strong business background. He also had strong St. Petersburg connections, and that's probably where Putin found out about him. I think he started from 2000 to 2004. He was the Federal Tax Service chief, and then he was in St. Petersburg, and then and it's kind of another way he was kind of put into the system was he was married to Viktor Zhukov's daughter, and Viktor Zhukov used to be the first deputy prime minister of Russia until Ivanov replaced him. And then probably the last thing, so from 2001 to 2004, he was the tax service chief in St. Petersburg, and then he was appointed the federal tax service chief in 2004 for all of Russia. And at the time, he was involved in the whole Yukos affair when they broke up Yukos and took that down. But he was the head tax guy involved in that prosecution, and that's probably where he came to Putin's view of aptly handling that situation. Okay, and the first actions of when Putin came in 2007, he was, I probably say nothing about Serdyukov is, he was also called probably the first true defense, or civilian defense minister. Ivanov was a civilian, but he was also a colonel general in the FSB and a reserve FSB colonel. So he was definitely a military man, not an MOD guy, but a military man. And so he's probably a lot more palatable to the Ministry of Defense people than Serdyukov, which had no background. So when Serdyukov came into power, it was kind of assumed that he would kind of have that do-nothing attitude that maybe Ivanov had, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of changes, it would be business as usual. So he started making some reforms that nobody really paid attention to him, but it kind of laid the groundwork for future upcoming reforms. And what he did was he brought in the majority of his tax service staff. I think it was about 30 personnel from the tax service. He brought them over with him to the MOD. And they called this kind of the feminization of the Ministry of Defense. If you know the Russian military, it's a very masculine, very male-orientated organization. It's very few males you will see, or very few females you'll see at those top levels. And he brought all of his staff with him, and then he started plucking his people. He started putting his people into certain positions. So, and then he established a personnel inspectorate, and this is another way he had of controlling, who stayed in the military and who got out. And one of the ways that he, I guess the old system is you see a lot of older Soviet generals, and they have a Russian generals, and they have a mandatory retirement age. And if these guys want to stay beyond the mandatory retirement age, they'd have to petition the defense minister, and then the president of the Russian Federation would have to sign off for these older generals to stay in the military. And what Serdyukov did was he set up a personnel inspectorate office to approve these waivers for these older generals to stay in. And so for all the applications of officers that wanted to stay in past retirement age had to go through his personnel inspectorate office, and that office reported directly to him. So that was the way he kind of put the screws down on the military. So the guys that weren't helping him out, or the guys he didn't like what they were doing, he could retire them. And then later he started up an even more unpopular part of the personnel inspectorate, where they'd go out and do weigh-ins and physical fitness tests for these general officers. So they'd have imagine some guy walking around the MOD staff with a scale and a PT card, giving physical fitness tests. So that was another way he had of kind of rounding out some of these more troublesome generals. And then he made kind of made some internal switches in the MOD. He elevated there was like a financial services section that handled a lot of the financial transactions for MOD, and he started taking away certain things away from the general staff. Some of these armament procurement programs, started taking those away from the general staff, and he started putting them under the MOD. And then, if you know anything about the Russian military, there's a very strong culture of corruption, and one way he thought he could kind of stymie some of this corruption was to pull these procurement programs, not just for equipment, but for building construction, stuff like that, pull that away from the general staff and put that squarely under the Ministry of Defense. So what he did is he elevated his financial services department head. He elevated her to a full deputy defense minister, and then brought those services under her. So by mid-2008, so this is coming before the Georgian War, there was definitely a rising tension between Serdyukov and General Balyevsky. And eventually, I think Balyevsky submitted his resignation 3 times before it was finally accepted. And so they did away with him. And they replaced him with General Makarov. And the Chief General Staff, General Makarov, is a very different type of officer than Balyevsky. It's kind of Serdyukov was known for. He's known for kind of doing these spot inspections all around the Russian Federation. Like he'll just get on a plane, he'll fly to a place, get off, and walk around and do an inspection. And that's not something that the Minister of Defense before him were known for doing. And a couple times he didn't like what he saw and just relieved the person on the spot. But one of the guys that he really had a high opinion of was Makarov. I think he was the Eastern District military commander. And Serdyukov had a very high opinion of Makarov, the way he ran his military district. And kind of what separated a guy like Makarov from Balyevsky is Balyevsky spent all his time in the general staff, which is very common for like the senior leadership. He went from one staff position to another staff position in the general staff. Makarov spent all his time in commands out in the Eastern Military District. He was definitely a field officer. He also had kind of a reputation of a reformer. Draft evasion is a very common problem in Russian Federation, and the military district commander, he's kind of responsible for the draft for his military district. And so Makarov had set up a website where people could, put in tips about, draft evasion or corruption or bribery going on involved in the draft process. Okay, so after, so this is mid-2000, this is late 2008, in August 2008, when they have the Russo-Georgian War. And the Russian military, the first report says that everybody was happy with the Russian military. But later reports, come out that, the performance of the Russian military was not what they wanted, and they were very disappointed about how Russian military forces did. So, and then there was a lot of speculation that Serdyukov, he was going to be pushed out of office. He was going to be forced to resign due to the poor performance. And eventually that kind of subsided, and by December, Serdyukov was still in power. So that kind of suggests that the civilian leadership, Putin and Medvedev, were standing squarely behind Serdyukov and his reforms. So by December, Medvedev identified 5 areas to improve, and he wanted to abolish all the skeleton units. We talked about those cadres of senior officers that were manning units, and he wanted to replace all those units with units that were fully ready. Like a normal, we think of like an active duty military unit. A bunch of guys sitting on a base that are ready to move. And he wanted to change the command and control functions of the Russian military. They weren't pleased how when they were fighting in Georgia, how they had a hard time communicating and controlling the forces. They wanted to revamp the officer education and training system. They still had the same education and training system, for the 5 million Soviet soldiers as they did for, the much smaller 1 million man Russian army. And they wanted to use more modern weapons. So that's a big thing in Russia. You hear about all the weapon modernization programs, and they do buy a few trinkets here and there, but for the guy out in the field, you don't really see new tanks for a whole unit. You just see, certain strategic weapons will be bought in, or a certain elite unit may get new weapons, but it's not a complete outfitting of the military. And the other thing, the popular thing is that they want to increase pay, housing, and social amenities. So, the benefits are really important for Russian military. And in the early 1990s, there was really dire straits for how these guys were living, and things improved quite a bit since then. So the Russo-Georgian War was not the cause of future reforms, but it definitely pushed things along. So this stuff was, future reforms I'm going to talk about, they were already in the works before the Russo-Georgian War happened, but this just kind of moved things along. And then, so here's kind of the reforms that were made, or they're planned to be made. There's been some backpedaling. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But you can just you can tell from this is an infographic from RIA Novosti, and it really shows well how these reforms are going to look, how the reductions are going to size up. And you can kind of see at the top, the first little graphic where it says division and brigade. And basically what it's saying is, in the old system there was, there was a soldier on the ground. There was the, the next kind of higher level echelon was the soldier on the ground, and then they wanted to abolish the division and the regiment and replace it with a brigade. So that would kind of eliminate a whole level of bureaucracy between that soldier and the command. And then they have some, pretty serious troop reductions you can kind of see. And then here's the military districts that we're talking about. And it's kind of tough to make out, but you can see there's 6 military districts on the top, and there's 4 on the bottom. The next picture it'll be a little easier to see it. But when they abolished these 2 additional military districts, all that infrastructure and all that staff and all these officers that are associated with those positions would go away. It would go down to 4. Next slide. So here's here's kind of now what the Russian Federation military looks like now. They have the 4 military districts, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they have the Russian brigades. And these brigades are supposed to be fully staffed. I don't know if that's quite happened yet, but their plan is for each one of these brigades to have a fully functional, fighting group of troops in them, fully equipped, fully manned. So. And there was another kind of more subtle change that was made. They just didn't change the number of military districts. They kind of changed the relationship between these military districts commanders and the troops that were on the ground. Before, in wartime, the general staff would kind of take control of the military units. A lot of times these military district commanders were more, a lot of supporting roles, draft, conscription, maintaining the force, facilities. But when they reformed this, they made a change to how these commanders are going to be treated. These commanders would now be in charge of all the troops that are located on their territory, with the exception of the strategic missile forces and some of the Spetsnaz units. But they're gonna own everything. So these, it's kind of like our MACOM system where you have the CENTCOM commander controls all the troops for CENTCOM. Well, this is the kind of the way they're going to. And they would not have this structure until there was wartime, and then they would change the name from military districts to Joint Strategic Command. So, and there's also talk that maybe there just wouldn't be MOD units under these military districts. It could be, MVD units or not FSB, but border troops units would all be subsumed under this one military district, or it would be called Joint Strategic Command Commander. So probably some of his most unpopular forms with the higher level officers was his reductions for the general staff and the Ministry of Defense. And you can see, the number of troops he talked about. I'm not sure, this is what they were proposing to cut a couple of years ago. I'm not sure how these numbers actually came into being. If there's somewhere between 12,000 and 5,000 where the numbers fell out at, but it definitely was a reduction. So, and then this reduction was so severe they sometimes call it a purge of the leadership because so many officers were forced out. And okay, the other forms is we talked earlier how after World War II they really did have professional, enlisted soldiers, kind of like we have in the U.S. military. We have a very professional NCO corps, career path, and the Russians really wanted to develop the same type of system for them. Maybe a little bit different, but they definitely wanted to have that not such an officer-heavy rank structure. So they've started to develop some NCO academies or non-commissioned officer academies, and it's a little bit different system than we have today for our military. We think of academy for our enlisted soldiers, it's 6 to 9 weeks, and their academy is more like a associate's degree. They'll go from 2 to 3 years, or 6 months to 3 years, depending on the specialty. And they'll get leadership training and specialty job training. So probably for us, we think of it more like a warrant officer. We would think of it as a non-commissioned officer. And then one of the, I won't say call it counter-reform, but one thing that Serdyukov did not push is, until Serdyukov came in, every defense minister's goal had been to eliminate the conscription system. And Serdyukov took a step back from that and said, there's no way the Russian military can function without conscripts. So he wanted to change, first of all, he accepted there was going to be a conscription system in the Russian Federation. It was just a matter of how it was going to look. Until these reforms came, there would be two types of units in the Russian military. There would be units for conscripts, and there would be units for contractors. So the contractors would get paid more. The officers in charge of them would get paid a little bit more, and conversely, the conscripts, obviously be paid much less, and their officers would be paid less. Serdyukov wanted to do away with the system. He kind of wanted to merge the two. He wanted he was pushing for a policy that in order for a soldier to become a contractor, he'd have to do 2 years as a conscript, and then he could sign a contract to become a contract soldier. And then he wanted to mix the units. So he wanted the contract soldiers, he wanted them to be in charge of the conscripts in order to cut down on some of the hazing. He also wanted to overhaul the reserve system. I don't know how they're doing with this, but they have talked about developing what we call like a U.S.-style reserve system with troops that would train periodically, get paid, and form like an operational reserve that can be called up in the event of wartime. So these guys would train up maybe once or twice a year, and then in wartime they would be called up for full active service. And another very unpopular reform of Serdyukov was reducing the number of military academies. He wanted to reduce the number of military academies from 65 to 10. And we think of military academy here as we think of West Point, or Annapolis. We think of like a 4-year college or university setting. And it's they have a lot of the very similar schools in Russia, but they do have some different ones. They have like some Surov schools. It's like, I don't know, schools for like grade schools and high schools for like the sons of officers or for orphans. They have a different type of education system. Sometimes you'll have like orphans in a military school, and that's something that the Ministry of Defense runs. They're talking about trimming down some of those and putting them under the Ministry of Education. Okay, some of the obstacles that Serdyukov's facing is, senior military leadership. They are all about this mass mobilization principle. They are still ready for the Americans to come storming through the Fulda Gap. They want to have all this combat potential. And, kind of, I would guess the view of Serdyukov and Putin is maybe the mass warfare conflict of old probably isn't too likely. What's more likely is, the situations that we have in Chechnya and these low conflict situations. So the other thing is that the military is really unhappy about is they kind of see this Serdyukov's reform as the quote Americanization of the Russian army, and they do not want to see the Russian army end up looking like the American army. So they're very, very critical of some like this MACOM, like the Joint Strategic Command concept. Very critical. Probably the most damning problem that Serdyukov faces is lack of whole card cash. They talk a lot about modernization, but they just don't have enough money to buy brand new equipment for all the troops, or outfit a lot of units with heavy end items like tanks and trucks and stuff like that. And so no matter what kind of organization or structural reforms they make, they're still got the same old crap they're still trying to work with. It's really problematic. And one thing that Serdyukov's really having a tough time now with the Russian Federation of clearing the books of personnel is they have very strict laws in most of the former Soviet Union about how retirees are treated. In general, when somebody retires from the military service, they're given a house or a flat or apartment. And the problem is that there's always been a housing shortage for the military, and they don't have enough houses or flats to give to these Russian officers. So they can't forcefully retire them, so they just leave them on the books. So they have, because these officers don't want to retire from active service and give up their apartment where they're living at now and not have any place to go. So they just stay on the active service rolls. So until they have some way of, some kind of massive housing, either legislation change or a massive housing build, they're going to have these officers kind of sitting on their books. Not going to be able to get them off. And, this enlisted professionalization that I talked about earlier, these NCO academies, it's pretty much going nowhere. They're not having a lot of success. They had a couple of academies they set up, but they're really having a hard time filling them with qualified candidates. So, I think the first class are supposed to have a couple hundred soldiers, and I think they have like 30 or 40 that were qualified. Some of the successes is pay and benefits are definitely on the rise. I'd say the pay for the Russian Army officer now is they always complain about their pay, but I'd say it's very competitive for the Russian population as a whole. If you're living in Moscow and you're a colonel, I think you're doing very well with stuff. I think some of the guys maybe kind of out in the sticks, I think maybe their quality of life is quite a bit lower. But, and some of the other successes is these echelons we talked about, these 2 military districts, the regiments and divisions being converted to brigades. They have they've eliminated some of these superfluous echelons, kind of like eliminating the College of Arts and Sciences and having report directly. It's all just bureaucracy in the university. Well, it's the same thing in the Russian military. It's like deleting a couple of these levels of bureaucracy. And some of these reforms have also led to the officer enlisted ratio we talked about earlier. There's 120 generals for every one soldier, or for 1 general for every 120 soldiers. The Russian Federation has really been doing a good job with getting those numbers more in line with Western armies. And I think now for the motorized infantry brigade, it's about 1 in 15. That's very, very comparable with Western militaries. So in general, most of the Russian successes have been involved with cutting bureaucracy and cutting out some of these superfluous layers. So, I think like any other reforms, kind of been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The officer reductions have scaled back from, eventually they said they were going to go down to 150,000 officers, and that's been drawn back to about 220,000 now. I guess they said they're going to set up some new organizations where they need these extra officers, but still, they did cut quite a few from these extra billets, so there definitely was a net, loss of positions. Another kind of, nitnoid thing that happened was, like these elite Spetsnaz units, they were supposed to be under control of the military district commanders. And they kind of backpedaled. They put them under control of the military district commanders, and for whatever reason, they decided to put those back under the general staff. So, in general, not all the reforms appear to be well thought out. It appears to be kind of happenstance. They'll try something, see if it works, and if it doesn't work, they'll flip back. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of forethought being going into some of the reforms. And we have a businessman making decisions. Military isn't a business, so you always it's tough. You can imagine if a CEO came into the American Army and started clipping off things. You can imagine how well things would work. It's just different kind of a model, different kind of business model. So conclusion, are the reforms being made in the Russian military? Yeah, absolutely. They're making huge reforms. But are these reforms effective? I don't have a clue. Time's going to tell if how effective these reforms are actually going to be. I hate to say it, there'll probably be another military conflict in a couple of years. That would be the only way you're really going to tell if these reforms actually, produce any better results than the Russians did when they had the Georgian conflict. So, and then probably, the takeaway from it is, how are these reforms going to affect the other power ministries? I think one of the reasons that the Russians had this, or the Soviets had this system where they had these different military units kind of spread through, their government, was because they didn't want too much power in the hands of the Ministry of Defense. They wanted that. They wanted these different military units kind of dispersed where they could, so nobody could do a coup and do a change of power. But I think now the civil military relations with the Russians are, very good. They have very firm control of their military. So I think now there might be kind of a drive to kind of consolidate some of these military forces. Maybe bring, some units of FSB, the MVD, infantry voice troops, kind of bring them back under the Ministry of Defense, because they don't need this, all these superfluous levels of infrastructure. And they've already been kind of flirting around with that. The MVD troops, they've already kind of they're practicing with consolidating their logistics structure for MVD, the MVD troops with the Ministry of Defense for areas in which they work. So if those kind of changes continue, you could see them, eventually, the MOD subsume some of these other military units. So I think that's it. You guys have any questions? Yeah.
I have a question about the conscription